United States, Mr. Lincoln, the 16th, is on the grounds here somewhere. He insists on calling me Mr. President, but I told him stop doing that. There's only one president at a time, and he's it, not me. So Mr. is just fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. I'm here because, as you understand from this weekend, the Confederates have made their way across the Susquehanna River. The bridge across the Susquehanna between Whitesville and Columbia was, they attempted to burn it, but it didn't get done. So the Confederates from John Gordon's Georgia division got across, and they're headed to Philadelphia. And I was kind of hustled out of my house, Wheatland, which is on the west side of Lancaster, and they sent me out this way figuring I would be safer. Actually, I'm not so sure about that. My house is guarded by a contingent of militia and also the local Masons. And John Gordon has a reputation for being a very strict disciplinarian for his troops, and they are remarkably well behaved, I'm told, and perhaps they would leave things alone. I don't know. In any event, I sent my niece, Harriet Lane, who was my first lady, to Philadelphia for safekeeping. And just, you know that she was the first lady, the first woman hostess at the White House to be called First Lady, and that's because the newspapers got tired of having to say Miss Harriet Lane, niece of President James Buchanan, hostess at the White House all the time. So they took the phrase from Dolly Madison's eulogy, and we used it. We used it through my administration, and of course Mr. Lincoln has called that now too. It's just a newspaper, but it's handy. I must say I've been using it because I don't have to explain who she is that way. In any event, I don't know how this is going to work out. I understand that there's some fighting going on in this immediate area. I need to find out later this afternoon whether I can go home or not, and find out what sort of condition Wheatland is in. But in any case, I wanted to tell you also that, and I don't want to sound too injured or put upon or paranoid or anything like that, but the criticism of my administration since the war started, I think, is patently unfair. I have to admit, I admire the propaganda people for the Republican Party who have put together this full-scale onslaught on my character and my ability. I also am terrified of it because I can see what damage it can do. So I'm a little skeptical about anything anybody says anymore, although I must tell you that all of the newspapers are biased, and they even say so right at the top. We're a Republican paper, we're a Democratic paper, we're an American paper. The American Party was the more commonly called the know-nothings. And they're very, very blatant, and I've had some really first-rate journalists from Washington and New York tell me that if there is an accurate news story these days, it's a happy accident. So there we are. So everything is biased, and you're going to just have to put up with it. I'm sorry about that. But in any event, I want you to know that I did everything I thought I could to prevent fighting during my administration. I told the seceding states, right beginning with South Carolina, they were making a very grave error, and they were going to pay very dearly for it, and I believe ultimately that's going to happen. If you ask me to criticize President Lincoln, I won't do it. He's in a very ticklish situation, a very difficult situation, and I will back him 100%. Having said that, I do feel, and you'll see this after the war is over, I'm writing a book currently. I think he is making a couple of mistakes, but I will let that go until after the war is over because we need to be behind this 100%. The South has no business seceding, and there is no authorization for them to do that, and they've made a grave error, and they're going to pay, I'm quite certain. My philosophy and my thinking throughout the early part, throughout my administration was that the President of the United States must follow the Constitution absolutely. There is no variance. You can't make things up. You can't be driven by emotion. You can't be driven by popular opinion. You must stick to the Constitution just as it's written. The Constitution says the southern states can have slaves. I personally am opposed to slavery. I have been all my life. I've said so on the floor of the Senate during my tenure as a senator from Pennsylvania, and I've said so to anybody who wanted to listen. But the Constitution, which is the high law of our land, says that they can have slaves, and therefore they can until and unless they themselves change it. Or there's a constitutional amendment passed by the entire country. And there would have to be a consensus for that. And clearly there's no consensus today. Make no mistake, at the same time, that the Civil War is about slavery, nothing else. I have heard people talk about states' rights. I've heard people talk about tariffs. I've heard people talk about this and that, and the other thing is the cause for it. That is all nonsense. It is slavery, pure and simple. Now, there have been lots of arguments over these kinds of things. In fact, the most famous, if you're not aware, is between me and Senator Douglas, the late Senator Douglas of Illinois. And frankly, I don't mind saying, criticizing him. He split the Democratic Party. Some people are saying I did it. No, I didn't, because I'm following the law and I'm doing this legitimate and right and proper. And he's running around changing his mind about things and trying to undermine everything I've been doing. Because he wanted to be president and he would do anything on earth to get that job. And so he would, I think, betray his own feelings and his own principles to do it. But again, because I'm, the president is at the top and has to take all the credit or the blame for everything. So that's what happened to me. And incidentally, if you have any questions about anything, go ahead and raise your hand. Because I can babble on for hours, but if you want to have a question about anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Yes, sir.
What was the proudest part of your tenure as president?
Surviving it. The proudest part, I think, what I am proudest of is that despite all the angst in the North and the anger and the whatnot in the South as well, I stuck to my guns. And I said, this is what the law has to be. This is how we must behave because the Constitution says so. People said, well, Christianity requires us to do this, okay? But the same people on the other side were saying Christianity requires them to do that. And then not only that, then the politics over here, liberals, conservatives, and so on, and liberals and conservatives over here, and they can't agree. That's why we stick to the law. We stick to the Constitution because it is our baseline and it tells us how to behave. If we want to incorporate some of these things into the Constitution, that's all good, but it has to be done by consensus. We have to come to some sort of agreement. We have to negotiate. And now we're in a period where everybody wants to shoot each other rather than talk. So that's a problem. So in the meantime, we stick to that Constitution knowing that we'll be absolutely correct when we do it. I'll get off my soapbox now. Yes, sir.
Do you see any record that you had a disorderly conduct that almost had you expelled?
Oh, it wasn't. I was expelled.
Oh, you were. Excuse me.
A little background on the period. Nowadays, in the United States today, Americans adults drink about 4 gallons of alcohol a year on average. In 1850, adults and children alike drank 9 gallons of alcohol. Because the water was poisoned.
Right.
You had it right. So drinking at age 18, when I was a senior at Dickinson, was a big deal. Certainly. But what was is that I would get up on tables and dance. Respectful of myself. And I also was very, very negative and very, very loud about the fact they didn't like that. And so that was about that. Influential friends got me back in. Influential friends of my father, I should say, got me back in. And I graduated at the top of my class, but because of my behavior earlier, I was not allowed to be the valedictorian. And I've held that against that school ever since. I was stepping out of character. They claim, look, we graduated as president of the United States.
Exactly, that's what I was going to say.
This Buchanan and roll over his grave.
That's one of the reasons why I asked. Thank you, sir.
I'm a tour guide at Wheatland, along with my wife and several other very, very fine people, and we do a damn good tour. And I encourage you all to come out to Wheatland. It's at the corner of President Avenue and Marietta Pike. Tours, there are up to 7, 8 tours a day, depending on the season, for every day but Sunday. And you'll find it fascinating, I'm sure. If you sat here listening to all this, deep later on, you'll find that that's even more fun. Okay, so I encourage you to do that. He should have been arrested, he should have been tried, found guilty, and hanged, which is exactly what happened. So I have no sympathy for him whatsoever. No sympathy for anything he did whatsoever.
Do you feel like this massacre was very pivotal?
wasn't the South. It most certainly wasn't the South, because they said, see, that's what's gonna happen to all of us. Which again, I'm quite confident was nonsense. But it suited the South more than it suited the North, by a lot.
What's your feeling about the separation of Western Virginia from Virginia?
Okay, I have to check my calendar. Has that happened yet?
That happened
In 1863, but what date? No, okay.
June the 20th, 1863.
Okay. I think it's a little bit of manipulation on the part of the Lincoln administration to allow that to happen. However, I am very much in sympathy with their point of view. That is the Western Virginians, and I understand the predicament they're in. And it's historical, that division between the two. The Western Virginia and the rest of Virginia have actually functioned as two different states for most of their existence. So, I'm not sure I really am strongly inclined one way or the other. But it's a done deal. So, and the Congress has approved of it. And if the Congress has approved of it, that's a big plus. So, yeah, sure.
I'll follow up on the West Virginia statement. If you then expand it to a broader range, is it not exactly the same thing as what we're fighting for right now in the Civil War? We're trying to prevent states from splitting off and forming their own entity and identity. And yet you have Virginia and West Virginia willingly and allowed to be separated because it's an attack to attack the Virginians that are fighting against the Union. So is that not a little bit hypocritical of the federal government to be allowing it at a state level, but yet we have a state level for a nation and having states wanting to succeed? It seems very pot calling kettle black, in my opinion.
Could be. And I'm not in a position to argue with you on that, because I have sentiments that go both ways. Again, being a strict constructionist to the Constitution, there's nothing in there about that. So that leaves the field open.
So say if the southern states had just pulled away from the Union and not formed a confederacy, would that have been tolerated and allowed, since they were not individual?
No, a state is not allowed to leave the Union. You can't do that, because you signed on to begin with, and that's the way it has to be. Now, the West Virginians could argue that they are the real Virginia and remaining in the Union according to the philosophy that we should follow. A lot of people would say that's silly, but I think we're splitting hairs there a little bit.
Well,
Yeah, I understand. I will be quite confident that former President James Buchanan will have very little, if anything, to say about that. Sir.
No, just with you think about like General Lee, obviously went back to Virginia instead of being with Lincoln and fighting for the Union. It seems like in that era that it seems that people were more, Virginia is my state versus seems like the United States. So I'm from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is my state. Is there a reason why there was sort of a, I want to call it a territorial love for particulars?
No, I think it's inherent in all of us to a certain degree. But I don't have any sympathy for General Lee. I mean, he is a slaveholder, and he's unwilling to give that up. And he felt that the South was correct, and that's his option to take that view, but I think it's the wrong one. Yeah. And you could argue he's a traitor, raising arms against the government. And we'll see how that works out after the war's over. Now, can I step out of character for a minute? There's a story that goes with that. I don't know if it's true.
Okay.
But after the Civil War is over, there's a church service in Richmond, Episcopal Church. Most Southerners were Episcopalians. And the priest calls everybody to the rail for communion, and the first person to get up and move down to the rail is a black man. And the congregation is horrified. The next person to get up is an old white man who goes down and kneels next to him. It was Robert E. Lee. And that's when the war was over.
Interesting.
That's the story. I don't know if it's true. No. Sir.
I've heard many, and I've read many books in stating that when General Lee decided to fight for the Confederacy for his home state of Virginia, he actually released and freed all of the slaves that's, I mean, it's very well documented in multiple sources from, I'm just curious.
That really doesn't absolve his treason, if that's what it is.
Sure, I'm not stating that it does, I'm just saying for historical point.
Well, and there have been instances of that. Justice Cheney trained Haney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, had already freed all of his slaves.
Sure.
But came back and said, no black man in this country has any rights under the Constitution. Anyway. So I can't speak, I don't know what role that would have played, I don't know if it changed his opinion at all, or how, what effect it might have had on his politics. I just don't know.
Maybe just public perception.
But, of course, I'm not sure, because Virginia wasn't a state, but there were southern states where you weren't allowed to free your slaves.
It's true. Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina.
Yeah. Well, if you have no other questions, I can step out of character. I already did that, didn't I?
You did.
You want to talk about the Yankees?
Different Yankees.
So that's what happened to me. And incidentally, if you have any questions about anything, go ahead and raise your hand, because I can double on for hours. But if you want to have a question about anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Yes, sir.
What was the proudest part of your tenure as president?
Surviving it. The proudest part, I think, what I am proudest of is that despite all the angst in the north and the anger and the whatnot in the south as well, I stuck to my guns. And I said, this is what the law has to be. This is how we must behave because the Constitution says so. People said, well, Christianity requires us to do this, okay? But the same people on the other side were saying Christianity requires them to do that. And then not only that, then the politics over here, liberals, conservatives, and so on, and liberals and conservatives over here, and they can't agree. That's why we stick to the law.
That there was ever any chance for a peaceful solution, or do you think there pretty much had to be war?
I've read, let me preface my own opinion, I've read the Civil War became inevitable when Jamestown Colony was founded, and then subsequently Plymouth Colony was founded. Because Jamestown was founded on economics and Plymouth was founded on morality. And sooner or later, those two things were going to clash. In fact, that may be the undercurrent here, pretty much. Now, do I think the Civil War could have been avoided? Yes. If the abolitionists had remained quiet, I understand their opinion and support their opinion, but if they'd remained more pragmatic instead of emotional, I think we would have had an opportunity to talk to the South, particularly the northern southern states. States like Virginia and Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee may have been far more willing to talk about a gradual emancipation had the noisy people in New England not been so noisy. Right, and if we started earlier. President Jackson shut off the first secession attempt in 1832 just by the strength of his personality, but he owned the country by that time. By the time I became president, nobody owned the country. And so just a presidential pronouncement not going to have any effect. It did then, it doesn't now. Mr. Lincoln doesn't have that power either. Oh, and I want to point out something else, if I may. And I say this without anger. Mr. Lincoln's first inaugural address mimics my last message to Congress almost word for word. Certainly thought to thought, phrase to phrase. He and I have had, until the fighting started at Sumter, he and I had virtually the same opinion, same thinking about slavery, about the South and secession and all those issues. But as soon as that first cannon shot hit Sumter, all of that changed, and it would have changed with me too. Yes, sir.
Have you ever heard of Lincoln's 1862 letter to the New York Times claiming that he had no indication or inclination to abolish slavery if it would dissolve the Union and keep the states whole?
Yes, I read that letter, and that's very much what my opinion was also.
Any thoughts on that? Given the current climate?
Well, I think I did outline that somewhat, but in the current climate is a whole different matter. But let's go back to the day before Sumter's fire run, if you may, and because that is the day that everything changed. I'm perfectly happy. That's a bad phrase. I must be content because the Constitution says so to allow slavery in the states that want it. Mr. Lincoln was too. Neither one of us had any notion about coming in and just writing an executive order or something of that nature that says all the slaves are free. Mr. Lincoln can do that now because those states are in rebellion. And from any legalistic point of view, they've given up their sovereignty. The issue had always been in the 1840s and 50s what slavery will look like in the territories. They tried to resolve that in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. It worked. It got ruined in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, which, by the way, Mr. Douglas was very active in. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act just catapulted everything into chaos. My personal feeling is that the federal government is the one that decides whether there will be slaves in a territory or not popular sovereignty. But the Democratic Party adopted popular sovereignty, Mr. Douglas's idea, which on paper is lovely, but in practice is a whole different game, as we've seen in Kansas. And because I was running under the Democratic banner, I had to adopt that platform. And so I became an advocate, although a non-enthusiastic one, for popular sovereignty. But understand that the issue in the territories was whether it would be popular sovereignty or the government deciding whether slavery would exist in those territories or not, and then also where the demarcation line, if that's what we're going to do, is it, or how is this going to be handled? Again, it was kind of a tempest in a teapot to the extent that once you get west of the Mississippi River, the ground itself, the topography, the geography, is not conducive to slavery. It will fail, and you'll have a lot of starving people on your hands because they can't work the land like you want them to. It's just not going to work. So it wasn't going to happen anyway. And a lot of people felt that way, I must say.
Do we believe it's more of the right to choice or choose than more so the absolute constitutional given fact that I had to be able or had the right to, say, have slaves? It's one of those things that appears that we know it not to be a possibility because of the grounds.
Right.
I think it's more of...
Well, it was a big political issue across the territories and in Washington and in the North and the South because all of the issues were getting mixed up into one big bowl, if you will, and being stirred all the time. Yes, people said, I don't like slavery, but why can't they have it? Or I hate slavery, they shouldn't have it anywhere, anytime. All of this is going into the same pot and being stirred up. There was no clear thinking, other than me, frankly, that said the Constitution says this and that's what we have to do. The Constitution was silent on whether slaves would exist in the territories or not, but of course that really isn't an issue. The issue is who decides. And from my perspective, looking at the Constitution and reading it, a territory is not a sovereign organization by itself. It's a function of the federal government, and therefore the federal government should be the one determining whether there be slaves there or not. They don't have a constitutional right to choose. A state does, a territory does not. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to get Kansas in as a state as quickly as possible so they could resolve it on their own. After they become a state, popular sovereignty is absolutely required. Prior to statehood, in my judgment, it's the federal government that decides.
Mr. President?
I have an admirer who won't go away.
He's an interesting speaker.
I'm not complaining. I have few admirers these days. He and two others, actually.
No, I have the video on,
Oh, okay.
get a snapshot of it.